Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. It's been a little while since I've posted a podcast on here. Just a straight up podcast, not uploading the broadcast version of the podcast, but an actual dedicated free-form podcast. It has just been insane around here. For those of you who don't know, and I think probably most of you do know, I live in Houston, Texas. This show is based out of Houston, Texas, and a few of you have emailed me over the past week to check in on me, see how we're doing down here in Missouri City, Texas, which is basically it's not a suburb of Houston. Technically, it's its own city. But when you tell people internationally and from around the country, where are you from? And you say Missouri City, they're not going to know where that is, or they're going to think it's in the state of Missouri. So even though I live in Missouri City, Texas, when anybody asks, I say I live in Houston, Texas, which we're maybe 20 miles outside of Houston. Anybody who lives within 50 miles, I'd say, of Houston is going to say they're from Houston. Y'all know how that works. Anyways, over the past week, you may or may not have heard on international news sources that Texas was rocked with some bitterly cold weather. And I don't care. It's no matter how you slice it, it's bitterly cold. It struggled to get out of the teens during the day in Houston. That is so atypical. It is not common for Houston, for this far south in Texas, to see those kind of numbers. The suburbs just to the north of the city, we're seeing single-digit temperatures. I'm talking Fahrenheit here. So up in Kingwood, where my mom lives, which is maybe 25 miles from downtown Houston, it dipped into the single digits. I think it was between 7 and 9 degrees up at the Bush Intercontinental Airport, which is in Humble, close to Kingwood. That's the official readings for Houston. Whenever they say coldest day is on record in Houston, it's always taken from Bush Intercontinental Airport. And we were seeing single digits. It got down to, I was checking my phone throughout this process, I think the lowest was 15 degrees or so Fahrenheit here in Missouri City, which is south of Houston. Not way south, but like I mentioned, 20 miles or so south of Houston. 15 degrees in Missouri City? That's nuts. To put this kind of in context, for those of you who obviously don't live around the region, you live in other parts of the world and where it actually gets cold, Houston, whenever it dips below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, so just below the freezing point, it's big news in Houston. The news reports, make sure to wrap your pipes, make sure to protect your pets and your plants. It's going to dip below 32 degrees tonight for a prolonged period of time. It's going to be a hard freeze. We're going to see low temperatures as low as 28 degrees around the city. That happens every winter, maybe 2 or 3 times per winter. That's normal, that we see temperatures in the upper 20s Fahrenheit, or just below the freezing point. Because this part of the world, Houston, does not see temperatures like that very often. So when we had this recent Arctic blast, then that's all you can call it, is an Arctic blast. It came from the North Pole all the way down to Texas and beyond, to the Gulf of Mexico. We were seeing those temperatures 10, 20 degrees below what we typically see a handful of times of the year. So I'm recording this on a Tuesday. Last Tuesday, it struggled to get above 25 degrees Fahrenheit here in Missouri City. Now, it's almost 80 degrees outside. It is absolutely nuts. Last Tuesday, there was a couple inches of snow on the ground here in Houston, which in itself is a rarity. Today, it is sunny, it's warm. I thought about recording outside, doing my work outside. It's really pleasant. It's such a far cry from what it was last week. Now, I want to dive into that experience a little bit, again, especially for those of you who live up north or those of you who live outside of the country in colder climates. You'll see, and I don't want to beat this idea, to death, but you'll see people from up north commenting that they don't see the big deal. Southerners don't know how to handle cold weather. they can't handle ice, they can't handle snow, they freak out when it snows, they don't see the big deal. You need to prepare for cold weather. Everyone up north prepares for cold weather. They live in cold weather, they know how to deal with cold weather, so why doesn't the South know how to deal with cold weather? It's exactly like asking somebody in Minnesota to prepare for a hurricane. That's how prepared the South is for cold weather, because that's how rare it is that we see temperatures this low that we saw last week. Houses are not built to deal with temperatures like that. Plumbing is not installed to deal with temperatures like that. It is, we in the South are, as our buildings, our infrastructure is as prepared for really cold weather. I'm talking Minnesota cold weather. We're as prepared for cold weather as Minnesota is prepared for hurricanes. That's just the truth of it. It's not that that people in the South don't know what to do when cold weather arrives. It's that we prepare all we want, but our actual buildings are not built to withstand the temperatures. Again, if a hurricane, Category 5 hurricane, went up to Minnesota some way, it's almost meteorologic. Oh gosh, it's early. A Category 5 hurricane will never reach Minnesota, and if it does, hell is frozen over. Texas is frozen over. That's a better way to put it. These regions are not prepared for these types of natural disasters, and Texas is not prepared, South Texas at least, is not prepared for this type of natural disaster. And when it does come that far south, it is a natural disaster. When these temperatures come that far south, it is a natural disaster. I have not seen a disaster on this scale since Hurricane Harvey in 2017. We get hurricanes all the time in Houston, and it's hard to be prepared for. Our buildings are prepared for hurricanes as far as wind resistance, and they're built to withstand a certain miles per hour, a force of wind, certain knots, certain gusts of wind. Because we're right on the Gulf coast, we do get hurricanes. Buildings are rated for hurricanes, but buildings are not built to Minnesota standards. They're not built to insulation standards. Like I mentioned, the plumbing is not built to Minnesota standards, so that when we get these temperatures down this far south, it is a natural disaster in every sense of the word. So it was global news. No matter where you are in the world, I'm sure you have seen this news that the Texas electricity grid was crippled during this cold weather, and blame was flying around everywhere. Everyone is pointing the finger at each other. Well, you should have been prepared for this. You should have done this. You should have winterized this. You should have done this. This is ERCOT's fault. This is the energy company's fault. This is oil and gas's fault. This is the windmills' fault. This is the solar panels' fault. This is green energy's fault. People pointing fingers all over the place. And it is a huge embarrassment when one of the energy capitals of the world, Texas, goes down, when it can't produce enough electricity to keep its citizens, its residents safe. It's a huge black eye. So many Fortune 500 oil companies and energy companies are based in Texas. It is a global leader in energy production. So when the world stage saw that Texas collapsed underneath the strain of cold weather and over 5 million people went without power, it's a huge black eye. It's a huge embarrassment. So where do we put the blame? You have seen, probably, if you're in the United States at least, you've seen a lot of blame being thrown around. One of the first reports we saw, and I knew this would happen, one of the first things that, talk show host grabbed onto, were sharing pictures and sharing stories of our windmills that were frozen, or frozen windmills in Texas. We have wind turbines, wind generators, wind-driven electrical generators in Texas. We have a lot. We have some of the most wind turbines in the world, And maybe you wouldn't think of this, and I've touched on this in past shows, but you wouldn't not think of this. Texas has the most, not the most, but one of the most highest concentrations of wind turbines in the world. Around 20% of the electricity in Texas comes from renewable energy, and a big portion of that are the windmills. So these talk show hosts who have no incentive to share fact, They have no incentive to be scientific about anything. They know their audience. Their audience is who you think their audience would be, and they're going to eat this type of story up. They show the frozen windmills, then they blame it on socialism, and they blame it on, Joe Biden and the Green New Deal and all that for wanting to impose windmills when the windmills in Texas just freeze up and leave people without power. That's not the case, though. That's a misnomer. You know what actually happened? So the other 80% of electrical generation in Texas is oil and gas. And you know what also froze up and stopped generating electricity? Oil and gas. So a fraction of our power loss, a fraction of our power outages came from frozen windmills. And it wasn't even all the windmills that froze. It was just some of the windmills that froze and had to be defrosted. But that's what the media around here rent with. It's the windmills is why 5 million people lost power. No, the windmills is why a few 100,000 people lost power. The other 5 million people lost power because oil and gas failed. Now you might hear some people say, well, it can't be natural gas. A lot of our energy generation comes from natural gas and coal. It can't be natural gas because natural gas doesn't freeze at those temperatures. Natural gas freezes at a way lower temperature before it becomes liquid and causes problems in the pipelines. That's true. Natural gas does freeze at a much lower temperature than, 1 degree Fahrenheit, way lower than that. But you know what does freeze? Pipes and valves and infrastructure that is not set up to deal with these types of temperatures. So no, the gas didn't freeze in the lines. The natural gas didn't turn into liquid in the lines or turn into any form of matter that caused problems. But the valves actually froze. The pipes and the fittings froze and constricted and broke so that you couldn't open them, so that there were cracks. There was problems. They couldn't get the natural gas to the generators to make the electricity. And that's 80% of the power generation in Texas came from natural gas, oil, and coal. That all failed. So pointing the finger at a handful of frozen windmills is just beyond stupid. I'm sorry. You know that I try to keep it a little bit lighter here on Geek Therapy Radio. Sometimes I get fired up. Y'all who have been following me for the past few years know that I keep it relatively docile. But boy, howdy, when I get fired up, do I get fired up. And these misleading stories of the windmills causing all the power outages in Houston, it infuriated me. It was clickbait nonsense. It was not scientific. I don't even care. It's not a political thing. It's not about politics, at least in my mind. It's about being factual. And just even best case scenario or worst case scenario, however you want to put it, let's say that 20% of all renewable energy production went dead in Texas over the past week due to the cold weather. That means that only 20% of the power outages at most could be attributed to renewable energy. The other 80% of the power outages would be attributed to oil and gas, to fossil fuels. That's just the truth of it. And the actual more finite truth of it is it's not even that all the renewable energy generation went down. It was only pockets of renewable energy generation that went down, and also pockets of natural gas and fossil fuel energy that went down, that caused the power outages. So the same reason why those wind turbines froze, the same reason why those wind turbines and solar panels stopped generating electricity is the exact same reason the fossil fuel generators stopped generating electricity. And that reason is none of it was winterized. So again, I don't mean to get political on here, but this is just the argument that people have made. When they say that the wind turbines failed, this is what socialism brings. It brings failure to the power grid and all this kind of stuff. And the Democrats want to build more windmills in Texas, and if they do that, then we're not going to have electricity when it gets cold or a national disaster. No. It wasn't. There was nothing political about it. It was just that they were not prepared and not winterized. And you know what actually caused that? You know what actually causes that level of unpreparedness? Deregulation. It is actually, and I am not anti-capitalist at all. I fully embrace certain tenets of capitalism. I'm an American, of course, but completely unchecked, unregulated capitalism is what leads to these power outages. And I know that might sound controversial. And I'm not trying to poo-poo all over capitalism as a whole. This is just one facet. This is just one of the cons. There's pros and cons to every system of government. There's pros and cons to every system of financial markets. One of the cons of capitalism is this tendency towards deregulation. And the entire Texas grid was independent from the rest of the country for the most part and completely deregulated. What that means is that every link in the chain is going towards infrastructure, towards building the infrastructure, towards keeping it up, towards providing energy to residents. Every part of that chain, when it's completely deregulated, means that it's going to go to the lowest common bidder. That means when they build a pipeline or sourcing valves for a natural gas pipeline, since it's deregulated, they are going to go with the cheapest valves that they can get away with, because they want to make as much money as possible and save as much money as possible. So when you have a valve that costs X amount of dollars and you know that it's going to be prepared for winter temperatures below a certain temperature, but then there's a much, much cheaper valve that can't handle those temperatures, deregulation means that they're going to go with that cheaper valve that can't handle the temperatures. And they'll go with the one that doesn't handle the temperatures for two reasons. The main reason, again, is the deregulation and the cost savings, saving as much money as possible so that they can make as much profit as possible. Two, the idea there is that we can get away with that because it so rarely gets cold in Texas. Maybe once every 30 years it gets that cold in Texas to where we'll have to deal with this type of energy outage problem. That's another roundabout way of saying they prepared for what was average. They did not prepare for worst case. So they prepared for what happens 99.9% of the time. 99.9% of the winters we have in Texas. That's what the grid was prepared for. It was not prepared for this 0.1% of times when it's a worst case scenario. We get these Arctic temperatures that completely knock out the grid. That is a product of rampant, unchecked deregulation. They should have, and this is me being Captain Hindsight, and this is going to be a case study globally for decades, what happened in Texas here. They should have prepared for worst case, not just for average case. That's the simple fact of the matter. We need to bolster the electrical grid. Otherwise, you're going to have people blaming the windmills for freezing and completely ignoring that the natural gas lines all froze up and busted and broke and couldn't handle handle the cold weather. We need to winterize. We need to be prepared for worst case scenario, not average case scenario. So back to the windmills. And as you can tell, I've just been boiling about this for the past week. You know that also on the show that I don't categorize myself as a quote-unquote, and I say this in jest, a greenie weenie, that just because I have some solar panels on my house, I don't have a grid tied or anything like that, that I have some solar panels and that I have an electric car, that I'm some sort of environmentalist. I care about the environment, but I wouldn't categorize myself as a flaming, environmentalist, liberal, out there, stereotypical. I wouldn't characterize myself as stereotypical. I wouldn't characterize myself as a quote-unquote greenie weenie. And I say all that in jest. I mean, if you are a geek about environmentalism, that's awesome. We need geeks about environmentalism. You do play an important role in this world. I am just not that huge of a geek about environmentalism. I care about it. I recycle, have solar panels, drive my electric car, but I care more about being reasonable about things and being factual and reasonable about our implementation. Because you have some people saying Texas needs to go all green electricity in the next, 10, 15 years or so. That's not feasible either. The fact of the matter is the truth is always somewhere in between. It's always a gray area, that the transition to renewables is going to be on the back of fossil fuels. We are always going to need fossil fuels as a backup to a worst case scenario. So yes, if Texas goes to 100% renewable energy like other countries have, if Texas goes 100% renewable, we still need fossil fuels as a backup. So in case something happens to the renewable grid, you always have a backup source of power. And I guarantee you every country that has gone 100% renewable has some sort of contingency for backup power generation. So somebody with a bunch of solar panels on their house, for instance, let's say they get 100% of their power from the sun. They're all set up for that. It's still a good idea to have a gas generator, to have a gasoline generator, just in case something happens and you can't produce electricity, or you run out of battery storage and you can't meet the demand with the solar panels for some reason. You need a backup. Maybe you'll never need the backup, but you have to have that backup. Fossil fuels, for anybody listening right now, is always going to be a part of our life. Nobody listening right now is going to go to their grave with fossil fuels being eliminated from the picture globally. It's just not happening. It's just not feasible. It's not wise. It's fancy pants fairy tale land to think that within our lifetime we will be completely rid of fossil fuels. But that's not the point. The point is to be on a progress path towards that end. And maybe some of you listening might be more conservative than I am, and that's fine. It's okay to be conservative, by the way. It's okay. You don't have to be ashamed of being conservatism, despite what you hear in the media trying to make you feel guilty for it or labeling you some sort of way. It's okay to be conservative. But to you who may be heavily leaning toward that side of the aisle that thinks that green energy is the devil and it's going to kill jobs and it's going to be the end of the world and we're not going to be able to heat or power our homes if we go to renewable energy because everything freezes up and solar panels will get covered in snow, and what about when it's cloudy? What about when it's nighttime? What about when the wind's not blowing? What about when geothermal pockets, cool down or whatever? You know what? We'll figure it out. And there's always going to be money to be made. I think there's this disconnect that if we make it all renewable energy, then no one's going to have to pay for energy, and then people are going to lose jobs. We're not going to be generating that wealth and that income, and we're not going to be paying $150, if you're lucky, electricity bills. That there's this notion that when we go to renewable energy, that means everything's just free. Let's all just sit around a drum circle, kumbaya, free energy for everybody. No, rest assured, my friends who lean quite far to the right, rest assured, there's going to be money to be made from a renewable energy system. There's still going to be engineers and field workers out there that need to maintain a renewable energy system. So I've alluded to before that the future is that, no, maybe our grandchildren won't be out there in the oil field, but they'll still be out there in the wind field or the solar field or the geothermal field or whatever, solar collector fields for steam generation. There's still going to be a need and a demand for engineers out in the field. Maybe they're not going to be at the oil well, but they're going to be at the solar farm maintaining it so that it doesn't go down when it freezes over or when it snows over. It's just a transition. It's just a transition. It's not the end of the world. For people on both sides of the aisle, it's not going to be a light switch that you throw to instantly convert to everyone driving an EV tomorrow. That's not going to happen. It can't happen. It is factually impossible, scientifically impossible for it to happen. For a quote-unquote greenie weenie, if you want to call them that, who get on comments and threads and say, Ford needs to go to all electric vehicles next year. We can't be manufacturing any more ICE vehicles at all by next week. We need to throw the switch. It needs to be all EV tomorrow, basically. The grid, it can't happen. For many reasons, that can't happen. That's pie in the sky, wishful thinking, fairy tale land to think that we can transition to all electric cars within the next, I'm going to say, 50 years would be that's pretty short. That's pretty optimistic. Thinking we can go to all electric cars in the next 50 years, everything, I'm talking transportation, personal vehicles, all that in the next 50 years. Could it happen? I think it could happen. Will it happen? I don't think it will happen 100% in the next 50 years. Maybe. That's one of those things that I would love to be wrong about. The point is, it's not happening next year. It's not happening tomorrow. It's not happening within the next decade. Everybody, you should take that with some sort of relief that no, it's Joe Biden, for instance, not going to get in there and sign a Green New Deal or whatever, and that just means that the world's over, America's over, he signed the Green New Deal, we're all going to die. No, it can't. It can't be like that. Even if the president wanted it to be like that, it couldn't be like that. It's not going to be like that. You can rest assured that it won't be like that. You will have to come to terms with the fact that more and more Like I mentioned earlier, our grandchildren won't work in the oil field. They'll be working at the solar farms. So I've gone off on my rant, and a lot of that is just commentary. Take it for what it is. You can 100% disagree with what I said. You can 100% agree with what I said, or you can be halfway in the middle. It's fine. It's fine. We're just having a conversation here. I just wanted to point that out, that what you heard for the last several minutes was just me editorializing. It was just commentary. It was just my opinion, which I think is important in this day and age. Nobody presents things as opinion. They present it as fact. I'm telling you, I presented the last few minutes as opinion, and that's fine. You can have your own opinions on the subject matter. But I want to move on to those solar panels and the wind turbines, the stuff that froze over, the stuff that got snow on them. You know, solar panels got snow on them. They can't generate electricity when solar panels have snow on them. Here's the fact that idea leaves out. There are windmills in solar farms and wind generation farms in the Arctic Circle. There are wind turbines that operate well below freezing year-round just fine, because they divert some of the electricity that they generate themselves to keeping the turbines warm. It's a certain percentage of electricity that gets siphoned off from the windmill to keep itself warm, to keep it from icing over. It's like the de-icing on a wing. It's almost exactly like the de-icing elements on an airplane's wing. Basically, windmills are just gigantic optimized airplane wings to catch the wind and maximize efficiency for turning the generator. And they have de-icing elements in the Arctic Circle. They have de-icing elements in parts of the country, of the United States even, that get cold. They have the de-icing elements so that the windmills stay operational even in sub-zero temperatures. Texas didn't have that. And I go back to, because the windmills are built to the lowest common bidder, and they are not prepared for those types of cold weather. Retrofitting or adding new machinery or infrastructure to winterize the windmills, to winterize the solar panels. You can heat up solar panels too, so that the snow just hits it and melts and comes right off. That's the way solar panels work in frigid climates. That's not how they're set up in Texas. My point is, the Texas electrical grid failed not because of one source was more inferior to another source. It wasn't because the windmills were inferior to natural gas. It all failed. All of it failed because none of it was winterized. It was all set up for average case scenario. None of it was set up for worst case scenario. The other part of it, I just want to get that out there, that the root cause wasn't windmills, and the root cause wasn't coal piles freezing up or natural gas getting stuck in behind frozen valves. It was all of it. All of that. The unpreparedness for the winter caused all of that across all energy generation in Texas. Adding insult to injury is that the grid of Texas is an independent grid, and there's only a few, but that means that we generate and produce our own electricity in Texas. We don't import it from other states, and we don't export it to other states. I mean, we do import some, we do export some, but for the most part, we are energy independent, which in itself seems like a good idea, except when it's so deregulated that everything is built to the lowest common bidder, and anytime we have a hard winter come around like we just had, we go out of power. That's not good enough. The insult to injury is, since we were so independent, it was very hard to source and connect to outside power from other states. So states like Oklahoma and Arkansas and New Mexico that are set up for more of these kind of harsh type winters, we're still generating electricity, and I'm sure they would be more than willing to give us some of the electricity from their grid, but we just didn't even have physical connections to tap into it. Or for some bureaucratic reasons or for some governmental reason, we couldn't. It was hard when we needed it. When we needed to borrow some electricity from outside states, we couldn't do it for the most part. There are some along the border, like in Louisiana, that can siphon off some of their power to give to us, but it's nowhere near enough to meet demand when our grid goes down. It was just a rough time. And all I want to end with on that matter is just what you should know is that, again, it wasn't wind energy that failed. It wasn't oil and gas that failed. It's wind and oil and gas that all failed because the grid was unprepared for it, because the contract work went to the lowest bidder to prepare for the average, not prepare for the worst case. That's exactly why the grid went down. So going further, this is going to be a case study for years. The world is going to study what happened in Texas in the winter of 2021, in February of 2021, as a case study for what not to do. And that's kind of the little bit of good, like the silver lining. I always look for silver linings in things. That's kind of the silver lining that I take away from all of this, is that, man, it's tough to say because people really suffered. People are still suffering right now as I record it. But the silver lining is that we'll learn from it. Texans and Americans are resilient. We have our metal tested a lot. Sometimes we test it for reasons that we shouldn't. Like the amount of people willing to die on the anti-mask hill is frankly staggering. And I think that people around the world look to the United States and see it's a small group of people. It's not everybody. But the anti-maskers who pretend like masks are such an infringement of liberty, and they're being tested, and it's the government overstep, and they're really being punished by the government and bullied by the government, and the government's too big, and it's all because of the masks. It's ridiculous. It's such a stupid hill to die on. Masks, wearing a piece of cloth over your face on private property for 10 minutes while you try to go buy milk, that's the worst thing the government's done to you? This is the straw that's breaking your back? This not wearing a mask to work and not wearing a mask to HEB? That's your hill to die on? If you told the founding fathers, Washington and Jackson and everybody who fought the Revolutionary War to make the United States free and independent of the Queen and King of England, if you told them, if they came back in time in a time machine, like, what's your big gripe today? We're wearing masks. You wear what? The government is asking you to wear a piece of cloth, on your face. They're suggesting, it's not even a mandate for the most part. They're suggesting you wear a mask when you go to Kroger. You don't even have to hunt for the food that you find in Kroger. It's all just right there, ready to go. How easy is your life that wearing a mask is the worst thing about it? It's the worst act of government overreach. A mask. If you could bring somebody, who rushed the Capitol, who infiltrated the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. a month or so ago, if you brought them to the actual mid to late 1700s in the revolutionaries, they'd piss their pants. They'd be pansies. They'd be cowering. In any shape or form to equate our plight wearing a mask to fighting off the King of England? Are you kidding me? How cushy are our lives to wearing a mask is for 10 minutes inside a Kroger is such a big deal. It's just weird. Again, that's commentary. That's me editorializing. Masks are uncomfortable. I wish we didn't have to wear a mask. If it was my choice, we wouldn't wear masks. But I mean that in that I hope a pandemic didn't happen. I don't mean that I'm anti-mask during a pandemic. I just wish that we didn't have a pandemic to deal with. I wish we didn't have to wear masks because of the pandemic. I wish it never happened. Don't get me wrong. But call me crazy, I'm just not bothered by it. It's uncomfortable and your glasses steam up, but man, where did this kind of, I kind of often wonder how my outlook, my worldview seems so different from other people's worldview. Like, why isn't a mask? Because I don't like big government. I mean, I'm a Texan. I want government to be in check within reason. I'm in favor of some regulation, like I just spent the entire podcast talking about. We need some regulation of our electrical grid. That will help. But I'm not a fan of big government overreach. I want the government to leave people alone. I mean, ideally, just leave us alone. But requesting that we wear masks is not a bother. And I wonder why that worldview is. I wonder why for me it's not a bother, but for other people they'll die on that hill. They will absolutely die on the mask hill. They think it's the worst thing to ever happen to the United States, wearing a mask. Ask the greatest generation that fought in World War II, bled and died on D-Day to beat the Nazis and free the Jews. Ask them how bad wearing a mask is. They would give you the finger. They would laugh at you. Like, you do realize what this country's been through. You do realize what we've done for the world in the past. You do realize how hard that was and how much blood was shed towards that end. And your pansy butt can't handle wearing a piece of cloth for 10 minutes to go purchase prepackaged meat that you don't have to hunt for. Sorry. So sorry that you have to wear a mask. My goodness gracious. So why is my worldview outlook like that? I think it's because my grandmother still, this is just one part of it. My grandmother is still alive. Thank God. She's 98 years old. She lived through the Great Depression. She saves coffee grounds. She does all that. And she's been through hardship. That's what I'm saying. She's been without and been through hardship. And my great-grandmother, who I was blessed to know for 18 years of my life. She lived to be over 100 years old, and I could ask her. She was born in 1899, and I could ask her about the Titanic sinking. I can ask her about when electricity came to their farm. I could ask her about when indoor plumbing came to the farm, because she grew up without electricity and using an outhouse. She was a teenager when the Titanic sank. Been through World War I, been through the Great Depression, been through World War II, all of it. So from a very early age, I've had this kind of respect, not to take so much for granted. And I'm reminded of that every time the electricity goes off, every time the water goes out. We don't have electricity and water. We take that for such granted these days. And when you get to the point of a society where you take electricity and water for granted, of course you're going to be butthurt over wearing a mask. We have it so freaking cushy now that any minor inconvenience is seen as a huge government oversight travesty. That is such a personal attack on the citizenry by their government. It's remarkable. And the people that do it are like, did you never talk to your grandmother or grandfather who's actually been through tough times? And there's people in this country who have been through way worse than even them. Have you not even wondered about being empathetic or getting some perspective from people who've been through actual hardship? Like to me, and maybe that's just me being rational, being a rationalist, trying to be a realist. At least I think I'm trying to be. I'm just thinking, like, how do you get to the point where wearing a mask ruins your whole worldview? How does it get to that point? What went missing in the upbringing to make wearing a mask the end of the world? And I'm just using the mask as a general, for instance. There's other things that are minor inconveniences. When did inconveniences become a grave travesty? A grave personal attack on the population? When did it happen? Have we, our grandparents were the greatest generation. We had every opportunity in the world to talk to the previous generation and generations about actual hardship. We've become distant. I think we've come, there's a term, and maybe I shouldn't say this. Again, if you couldn't tell, this is just all commentary. Just my opinion. You can agree with it or disagree with it, whatever you want. It's fine if you disagree with it. If you disagree with it, let me know. Everybody's opinion is valid, whether you disagree with me or not. It's fine. But I've been toying around with this kind of idea in my head to what to label Generation X, Generation Y, Millennials, the iGen. Basically, to label anybody born from 1970 and onward, I guess. Maybe a little bit before that. So the World War II generation, they were labeled the greatest generation because most of them were born and fought through 2 world wars. And figured it out and brought in an unprecedented era of peace since then, for the most part. So that's why we call them the greatest generation. They also lived through the Great Depression. My grandmother's 98 years old. She's a member of the greatest generation. Her generation actually went through really tough stuff, really hard turmoil, like survival turmoil, and it just became normal. Survival was just normal. Survival for us now is abnormal. So they're called the greatest generation. What would we call our group? And I've been toying with this. And one of the terms that I come up with, and this isn't the end all be all, this is just kind of one term that's floating around my head, and it's subject to change because it might sound too harsh. But I might call our generation and a couple of generations before us, down to baby boomers after the greatest generation, from baby boomers onward, we might be labeled the wasted generation. And maybe that's a good term because, one, we are consumers. Our generation's mass communications, everything from the 1950s onward, post-World War II, we consume. We comic books, and we have television and movies, and now we have internet and iPad. Like, we're wasted because we're just like mind numb. All we do is consume, which leads to its own problems. We consume ideas 24 hours a day from 24 hours of news networks, which is just pure commentary, biased commentary, no matter where you get it. If you get it from one news outlet, it could be biased liberal. If you get it from another news outlet, it's biased conservative. It means you're not going to get the whole picture from only watching one outlet. And you just become entrenched, and we just become this kind of wasted generation where we're buried, our faces are buried in a screen. Again, this is all just my opinion. And you can't convince a huge demographic of these generations that windmills aren't going to kill us. Like, you can't use any form of logic with a huge swath of our generation to convince them that green energy isn't going to mean the end of the world. For just one case, I'm just using that as an example. If we all go to windmills, we're all going to freeze to death in our houses. Oh, gosh. And I think that a lot of us in this wasted generation, there's no amount of logic you can use to change their mind. And I don't mean change their mind to think, oh, now I have to be this way. If I believe that green energy can work, that means I have to become a liberal. That means I have to turn in my guns or something like that. No, it just means you have to use a scientific brain for 5 seconds. You can you can keep your guns, you can keep your way of life, you can keep your family values, you can keep your marriage values, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Whatever, just don't push it on anybody else. You can believe whatever you want to believe, worship however you want to worship, don't worship however you don't want to worship. But let's just add a dash of science and reason to a lot of these arguments, to a lot of these thought processes. No, windmills aren't going to mean that your children will never have work again, or that we're all going to die and we're all going to freeze to death in winter storms. That's sensationalism. It's not true. It's not scientific. It's not reasonable. It's not logical. So there's a lot of us in this wasted generation that will never see that logic. Or they'll be afraid to turn over to that logic because they think that if I believe this, then I will have to believe this other thing, which is not true. You can make up your own mind about all sorts of things, have your own free opinion about anything you want. Just don't force it on anybody else. It's always wild to me. It's always, we're getting real here on Geek Therapy Radio. Again, most of this is just my commentary. It's always wild to me how obsessed some people are with what other people do privately in their own homes, specifically in their own bedrooms. Why do you care so much about what Billy and Bob do in their own bedroom? Why do you care so much about what Jill and Jan do in their own bedroom? It's their private property. I thought this was all about sovereignty and property rights. Why do you care so much about what they do? It's very strange. And then why do you care so much about what they do in their own private property, all the way up into passing laws to forbid it? Like, you're never going to meet these people. You're never going to see these people. Why are you so obsessed with what these private citizens do in their own time? It has nothing to do with you. Why are you so obsessed with it? It's just weird, and that's just my opinion. And it doesn't mean that you have to change your whole life to adapt to it. It doesn't mean that if you accept their lifestyle that you have to give up other areas of concern to you. Not at all. It doesn't mean that you have to stop worshiping your God or to start worshiping a God. It just means let people do what they're going to do privately. And maybe that's just a very American concept. Maybe, I know there are other parts of the world where this kind of independent, autonomous individual is a kind of a strange concept, and they can't understand why Americans are so hung up on this idea of individualism when it should be a group effort for the overall benefit of the community. To that, I'd say that really there are elements of that in the U.S. Consciousness, the betterment of the community. These people that are so obsessed with what Bob and Billy do in their own bedroom, they think that stopping that is what's best for the community. That if you could somehow stop homosexuality, then America would be much better off. The community of America would be much better. It's like a twisted sense of community, if I may be so bold. This idea that if you let somebody love who they're going to love, that means that that means all of a sudden you're not going to go to church on Sunday? Like, I'm a Christian. Anybody who listens to this knows that I am a Christian, and I work at a church and everything. But I don't understand and I can only speak for other Christians, some pockets of Christians, the evangelistic, like, why do you care? Why are you so hung up on the homosexuality thing? That's so weird. There's so many other aspects to society that actually cause pain and suffering and death and destruction. Why do you care so much about what Bob and Billy do in their bedroom and so little about people lining up at the border making shanty towns and tents out of rags to try to give themselves a better life? Like, that's an actual situation where you can improve the quality of life for your fellow mankind. So why are you so stuck on what Bob and Billy do in their bed? Like, what? It's just weird. It's just weird. You can have your faith or lack of faith and still believe other things separate from it. That's just my old take. You can believe in science, you can embrace science and love science and still keep your faith too. Just because you found out that evolution is a really, really good theory and a really good answer to how humans evolved, just because you realize, that humans evolved doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have to be an atheist. Like, it doesn't work. You can still go to church on Sunday in the lab on Monday. They're not mutually exclusive things. Scientists know that you don't go into a lab. If you do go to church on Sunday in this scenario, you don't go to church on Sunday and then go to the lab on Monday and do research, and then you come to a conundrum that you can't answer. No scientist who also happens to be Christian is going to write down in the answer field, well, God did it. Case closed. We can't figure this out. God did it. No. You can still go through the scientific method and the process and everything and still be a Christian on Sunday. You can still go to church on Sunday. Like, these things aren't so mutually exclusive. To the flip side, you can be an atheist and let people that you don't agree with live their lives in peace. Like, everyone is free to believe what they want to believe. Live and let live. Politically also. I love that my neighborhood is so diverse ethnically and politically. I love it. Because everyone in my neighborhood just gets along. Everyone's friendly to each other. Everyone helps each other out. And let me tell you something. I've spent a long time in this podcast talking about what happened in the past week in Texas and going over my opinions on what to do with the electrical grid and what happened in my own form of finger pointing and everything, my commentary. But here's the truth of the matter, and I think I'll start wrapping it up with this. The truth of the matter is that Texans, and I would imagine other state residents, but I can only speak for Texans because I just experienced this. When it hits the fan, when we go through a disaster, politics do not matter. People are helping each other. People are getting out there with the big trucks and four-wheelers and their generators, and they're not asking, when they go to offer help to their neighbor, they're not asking about the Joe Biden sign they had in their lawn or talk about the Trump sign that they had in theirs. It doesn't matter. Texans, at least, we roll up our sleeves and we help each other. Politics doesn't matter in a disaster at all. It's not even brought up. People just help. That's the initial knee-jerk reaction of Texans, is to help other Texans. Not even just to help other Texans, but to help other people in other states if they can. That's the first reaction. That's why I still have hope for humanity. People, I disagree with this whole idea of losing faith in humanity, because there are still really good bastions of hope in humanity. In how Texans help other Texans in a disaster, and how politics don't matter, and they're not even brought up, it's not even asked about. How Texans' immediately knee-jerk reaction to disaster is to help their neighbor is such great hope in humanity. That means all that isn't lost. We can argue about wind turbines, we can argue about fossil fuels, we can argue about electric cars, argue about gasoline cars, we can argue about Green New Deal, we can argue about deregulation, we can argue about socialism, we can argue about capitalism, whatever. Argue about face masks, whatever. None of it matters in an emergency. None of it's even considered or brought up in an emergency. What happens in an emergency, at least in Texas, is that people immediately start helping each other. Immediately. And it just paints how inconsequential personal belief is during a disaster. That at our core human nature, for most of us, at our core, we are helpful communal creatures. At our core, we want what's best for our community. And that is evident. The big experiment is when a natural disaster happens, you can see people do that. It's refreshing to know that it's terrible that it takes a disaster to reveal this in people, but when a disaster happens, when the TV turns off, when you're no longer watching Fox News all day or CNN all day or MSNBC all day, watching stuff about Trump's impeachment or what Joe Biden's doing with China or whatever, when all that kind of stuff turns off and it's just people with people, our default is to be good to each other and help each other. It's refreshing to see that. It's refreshing and hopeful to know that it's there underneath everything as a default foundation. And how trivial it is to have all these differences outside of it. We have very cushy lives, and when you have cushy lives, you start digging into making division more important in your life, when it's really not. It's false. We're really not as divided as we think. That's baby boy. I've got Riker in the room with me. Been rearranging the studio. I got to put something on YouTube too, but I just started the job at the Museum of Natural Science this week in earnest, which reminds me, after I'm done with this podcast, I got to start writing for the first video that we're going to put that I'm going to put on the YouTube channel, Houston Museum of Natural Science. It's been crazy around here. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Again, you're free to have your own opinions on things. That's great. If you want to talk to me about it or say I agreed with this or I disagree with that, that's fine. Johnny@geektherapyradio.com. That's the email. Johnny, Johnny, @geektherapyradio.com. Or you can just go to geektherapyradio.com. The first thing you see is just a contact form. And again, it doesn't put you on any mailing list. It's literally just sends an email to me. The same way a regular email does. But if you want to contact me through those ways, that's fine. Facebook, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, all that good stuff. Just look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and you'll be good to go. And I encourage you to reach out. I like talking to my listeners. It's fun throughout the week to hear all your opinions and what you're geeking out about and just kind of see what's going on in your life. I love all that. So thank you so much for listening. I upgraded my water cooling. I added a water cooler to my computer. My geek mind just goes all over the place. So I updated my AIO, and I'm about to get 2 separate M.2 drives, 2 NVMe drives, both of them 2 terabytes. Woo! This thing is going to howl. I got the RTX 3090 a couple weeks ago in there. Oh boy! It is a screamer. But that's it. We'll geek out about that another day. Thank you so much for listening to Geek Therapy Radio. No matter your walk of life, no matter if you agreed with any of my opinions in this particularly saucy, spicy episode, I need you to know that you are worthy of love. So does Riker. Riker thinks you're worthy of love too. You're worthy of giving love, you're worthy of receiving love, and most importantly, you are worthy of your own self-respect. You are worthy of loving yourself. So remember that above all else, you, no matter your walk of life, no matter where you came from, no matter your opinions or beliefs or lack of beliefs, you are worthy of love. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.